Hello, everyone. This is our podcast series, Beyond the Karman Line. And today, as our guest, we have Mr. Kevin Bridge, who has worked extensively with translations in aviation industry. And we can ask him more questions about this. And so let us start with the questions. Would you like to say anything before we start asking you questions?
Um, I'd just like to say thank you for being given the opportunity to appear on your podcast. I think I'm very impressed with the way you guys are integrating and forging links with external organisations like the Royal Aeronautical Society and other organisations that are going to be of great assistance to you, I think. And it's very impressive the work you do, aside from what you're doing for your degree as well, which is busy enough this year, I'd imagine. So, yeah, well done to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. So, the first question we would have for you would be, would you like to talk about your educational background and your work in aviation?
Okay, yeah, my educational background obviously is in languages. I'm not an engineer as such. I'm not a pilot or anything. I'd like to be, but I've really got the chance to do that. I studied languages in school. I did French and German. I didn't do Russian, not yet, until I went to university. In order to do two languages, I had to drop the science, so I only did one science, which was physics at GCSE. And then I went on to A-level and I studied German. And doing German, I studied the history of Berlin since the Second World War, as that history was being rewritten. So from sort of 91 to 93, as often Germany had been unified. And the history of the Berlin Wall and the history of the Cold War got me into Russian. So that sort of route got me into Russian, and I went to study Russian at the University of Portsmouth in 1994. I started from ab initio level, so I started from no Russian at all, to degree level in 4 years. We didn't really have a specific module for translation of technical material or anything like that, aviation. But we'd have translation classes, and we'd have to do what's called sight translation, where you're not using a dictionary, ideally, you're just giving a sight translation based on your knowledge of the language of the text that's in front of you. So sometimes that would be technical, sometimes it would be artistic, sometimes it would be historical, something like that. But we had quite a lot of free time to actually kind of get into what we wanted to get into. And I had quite an interest in the history of the space race. People like Sergei Korolev, who was the chief designer of the Soviet space race in the 60s. He wasn't known in the West for a long time. He was kept secret. He was their answer to Werner von Braun, really. And I looked at books on that. I looked at books on aviation because I was interested in that, and sort of helped me develop a vocabulary, I suppose, and an interest in that side of things, to be able to combine Russian with knowledge of aviation and look into that. So, yeah, that's where it all sort of started from. And a big plus for me was attending the Farnborough Air Show, which I had done since probably the late 80s, if not earlier. And watching the MiGs and the Antonovs and everything else, and the displays, and they were originally from the Soviet Union in those days, before the Soviet Union broke up. So in 1988, they brought the MiGs and the Antonov, and then that sort of grew from there. And that's actually how I started doing translation. Was I was stood next to a helicopter in the static pipe at Farnborough in 1996, and there was a gentleman next to me who wanted to know what the badge was on the side of the helicopter. So I asked one of the crew, I'd only done Russian for about 2 years by then. I asked one of the crew and said, "Can you tell me what the badge represents on the side of the helicopter?" It was a squadron badge. It was an IL-8. And I told the guy, and he said, I wanted to know that for a long, long time. And he gave me a business card, and that's how I started later on in translating for the Russian Aviation Research Trust, which is a charity that has the biggest archive outside the Soviet Union of Russian aviation material, aviation space. And so they commission books, and that's how I got started in translating aviation material, really. From being interested in doing my degree and meeting people from there.
This is very interesting, but I think in your answer you've almost answered our next question as well, which
Okay.
is what inspired you to work in aviation after education degrees in languages, and what continues to motivate you to stay in the field?
Okay. Yeah, it kind of goes back to the same thing in a way. I suppose I could say I grew up around aviation. I certainly grew up around aviation enthusiasm because my father is a big aviation fan, and his school friend, who used to go aviation spotting with in the 50s and 60s and see all some wonderful airliners and everything, he joined the RAF. And he said he joined the RAF to fly an aircraft called the Lightning, which was the first line interceptor in the UK until the late 1980s. And it was his job to go up and intercept Soviet bombers coming in towards the UK and hopefully turn them around from our airspace. And it's his stories of intercepting Russian bombers and his escapades in the Lightning. And after that, he was actually sent on his, within the confines of his RAF service, to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. And he said he realized that what he'd been told in the Cold War about how the Russians were and what sort of people they were was just a lot of it was just propaganda. They said these people were wonderful and they really, really looked after us. They're very friendly to us. They were great. And it just got me thinking that's going to be an interesting thing to do. And then traveling to air shows and watching the Russian contingent sort of astonished the West in the 1990s with aircraft like the MiG-29 and the Sukhoi Su-27. And watching Anatoly Koroch's displays, Russian test pilot, his displays with Vladimir Nagorovsky in Su-27 was just astonishing, really. They topped the bill everywhere they went. If it was an air show with Anatoly and the Russians, it was an air show, and it was really, really enjoyed it. And some of their development, some of their work was ahead of their time. Developments in like effective thrust and the ergonomics development on the effects of high G maneuvers on pilots. So a lot of that was quite advanced and ahead of its time. And the West was taken by surprise with that, really. And quite a long time to go, about sort of late 1990s. So that sort of inspired me to go into work and look at aviation as part of what I do as a translation. I think in terms of what inspires me now, I suppose it's similar things, really. It's still a technological industry. It's a very challenging industry. I think, like everything else, it's going through a lot of changes now. And but I think it's still looking forward. Things like the XB-1, the new supersonic aircraft, Airbus talking about zero emission aircraft as well, based on some hydrogen power plants and things. That's going to take it forward again into other fields and other forms of propulsion and that kind of thing. So I think that's still inspiring.
That was very interesting. So I have a question for you, which is, were there any extra skills you had to pick up after your degree to be able to fit in the aviation industry? And what skills would you say language students can have, which will make them really employable for entering the same work field that you did and work in the same industry and follow your path if they wish to?
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's a little bit difficult, not difficult, it's different, I would say, for translators and language people, because unless you're in the actual organisation, you tend to work for yourself, you set up a company or whatever you do, and you almost act as a little bit of a satellite if you're working freelance or you're working for yourself, because you sort of orbit the specialism. So you work something like aviation or law, and you're providing service in terms of sort of the business aspect or the research aspect or the academic aspect. So that, in a way, is a little bit difficult to answer, or different to answer for translators. But I mean, what I would say is that in my case, I suppose, I didn't really sort of go on lots of different courses and things and learn how to do it. I pretty much learned on the job and taught myself in a way. But I had some really good people who were, and I still consult with them, still work with them, who are very keen to explain things and answer questions and provide information, especially when it comes to the technical side of things, when you're working with technical manuals or something like that. But given that I had an interest in aviation, and I picked up vocabulary, Russian vocabulary from that, I was able to sort of match that up with my English vocabulary, the same thing. So once I did, about 10 years ago, I did a test for my agent, literary agent, and he said, can you do this test translation on a Russian hydroplane? SBR2, I think it was. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. It's by the Russian Aviation Research Trust. And he said, he rang me actually after I put the translation, I sent the translation to him and said, I actually want to thank you because you did a very good job. You translated it in the actual aviation terminology rather than just translating it the way the words would be in English. So it's almost like thinking on another level. You have to think what the words would mean and then think what they would mean in the context of that specialism or that piece of work. So you have to know what sort of ailerons are, what end parts of the engines are, how these things would work implied, in the same way that I suppose the engineers would know how the thing works implied and what the ailerons do and everything else. But I tend to read quite a lot, and I would say that's probably a very big plus. To read, if you go online and read things in the language that you want to work with, if you want to work with a translator, as a technical translator, either for yourself or actually in-house or whatever in the aviation industry, there's so much information in things like Facebook and online that are pages for organizations, in my case, like the big designer or the Russian, the Aviation Manufacturing Corporation in Russia, and they're putting posts in Russian online that you can read and therefore get to know the vocabulary, how they work and what they're doing and that kind of thing. So that helps a lot as well. I think in Russia, actually, it's very funny, the old Soviet system, because aviation was free, education was free in the Soviet Union. The thinking was that you could do sort of 2 degrees. You could go and do, say, a specialist diploma in languages, and then go and do something in aviation or space or whatever. And you need these 2 degrees almost to combine and make you a language translator. I think that's slightly different. It's almost more like our system. There's nothing to stop you, I suppose, doing that in theory, but I think in our system it kind of works differently. And if you study an art subject, you're not necessarily an engineer. If you studied engineering, you're not necessarily an art student. So it's difficult to try and combine the 2. But I noticed that when I was at university, engineering degrees did have a language component to them. I know one girl who was studying engineering, she was doing part of her degree was studying French, and other languages aspects to it as well. So I think that's good because it sort of helps us combine the 2 and have a language ready for at least some level when you're graduating to receive a degree. But I think language is always useful, whether it's your native language and you happen to speak 1 or 2 languages. I think that's always going to be useful, even if you're not a translator or an interpreter or whatever. to just use in your role, whether it's part of, it could be part of HR or sales or customer management or whatever, engineering. And it's always going to be an asset to you, I think, whether it's a language you've studied or it's a language you had as a child, you're born in with. Yeah, I think it's not a barrier to employment. It's an asset that you can use with other skills to present to your future employers and show what you can do, and so you can enjoy your chosen career. That's the plan, anyway.
And obviously, you're like very knowledgeable about aviation, but maybe that came from an interest in your background, as you've said before. But
No, so,
did you actively, after the end of your degree, look for an aviation job, or did it just come by your way while you were looking for other kinds of translation jobs as well?
not really. I didn't really look specifically, for the aviation industry. I wasn't really thinking of working in that. I knew I wanted to work with languages, and I went to work. Say I just went to work for the civil service for nearly 7 years, and after I came out of that, I wanted to do language work still. It was still in me to want to do that. So I got in touch with the Russian Aviation Research Trust via the chap who I'd helped with the helicopter years ago back in Karman. And he said, well, I can pass you on to a gentleman called Nigel Eastaway. He was a really, really valuable chap. He's a really nice guy as well. He basically runs the charity, and they're a charitable organisation, but they have an archive that is the biggest archive outside the Soviet Union. So they wanted to commission people to translate some of their stuff from Russian to English, because they had a bulletin that they put out for their members, for the people who sort of subscribed to it, for the charity, on Russian aviation and space. So I did a book on TV, which was the first book I ever did. And that was on his aviation development. He was an aviation designer, aircraft designer, who came up with all sorts of designs, from some that even haven't been implemented now, some that have been partially in Russia. There was experimental sort of hydroplanes and wing and ground effect aircraft and all sorts of things. And I did that, and then after that, I put in touch with my agent, who was the guy I did the hydroplane translation for. So that's how it started, really. And sort of 14 books on aviation later, I pretty much almost got it out of my system in a way. So yeah, it's still in me to do that.
Yes. So my next question would be, what advice would you give to university students aiming to enter the same industry and work in the same field as you want to?
Okay. I think having an idea of what you want to do and researching it, I think, is a good place to start, and getting involved and forging links with organisations like you guys are doing, like with your Space Society. I think it's very good to forge links with professional organisations like the Royal Aeronautics Society, although I can't speak highly enough of, really. They've been wonderful. And that's a very good place, because they have career supplies. They have a very good careers section. They like sort of helping students, and they're open to accepting anybody, into the awards for anybody, but they have student level, they have right up to fellow. And by anybody I mean, I suppose, they're not necessarily pilots or engineers, but people who have a wider remit in the aviation industry and not be so specialised. So I think they're quite open as to who get involved and to find assistance right now. I think if they're language students, which sort of goes with your question before, there's an organisation I'm part of. I've been a member since 2012, called the Chartered Institute of Linguists, the CIOL, and they're very good. They're a very professional organisation. They help linguists to get recognised, get a standard that they attain and they work to, and they can present that to employers, or if they're working freelance or they started a company that can act as a benchmark for them. So yeah, those sort of organisations are very good. I think also making contacts in the aviation industry as well, going to places like Farnborough. If you reckon go to the MAX air show in Moscow, if you speak Russian or whatever, and forge links with people in the aviation industry and think about what you want to do, be a bit proactive and connect with people and find your way forward through that, really. But I suppose what it boils down to is kind of experimenting and finding what works for you, and getting involved with things will certainly help, like voluntary things at university, societies, that kind of thing, will help you sort of decide what you want to do at the end of it, and you'll have something readily to put on your CV as well. You did your degree, but you also get involved with the Space Society, or involved with the Royal Aeronautics Society, did some intern work in the aviation industry or something like that. I think that's going to help as well. And sort of being proactive and doing the best you can, really, I suppose, is my answer to that. Yeah, I try to think of anything else as we go along that might help, but that's probably my advice I would give now.
What has been the most exciting project you've worked on, and why would that be?
It's been quite a few, really. I've been lucky enough to meet some quite amazing people in the work that I've done. About 10 years ago, I met the Russian author Yefim Gordon, who's quite well known in the Russian aviation publishing circles. He's done a lot of books on Russian aviation and aircraft and aviation development. And he was a really good down-to-earth guy, actually. And I did some work with him and a guy called Chris Pocock, who until recently was editor for Air International News, I think. But in addition to that, he was the world's expert on the U-2, the TR-1 spy plane that flew at the edge of space, and still does, actually. It's still in operation and enabling. So he's the world's expert on that aircraft. I believe he's flown on the aircraft as well. He's had a flight, lucky him, in the U-2 up to the edge of space. In the same way that James May, I think, of Top Gear, also had a ride up in the U-2. But he wanted to do some research on the shoot down of the U-2 in May 1960. The U-2 was piloted by Gary Powers, who was a reconnaissance pilot, and it was shot down. And he had some new information that was published in Russia on the shoot down, and what actually it was that actually shot down the aircraft, which battery, which missile. And he's actually used that on a website, on his website recently. Actually, he's done a feature on his website of this, and said, thank you to me for doing the translation, which is really nice. He's the world's expert on U2, and he's saying thank you for doing this. It's really rewarding. Other things I can think of, I did a book on air battles over the Baltic, which was history by aviation history, looking at the first day of the Second World War in Russia. So the first day of what they call the Great Patriotic War, when the Soviet Union got involved in World War II. And it was the first day that the Germans actually invaded. And it went through how unprepared the Russians were, really, and how unprepared the response was to the German invasion. And it was the first book to use both German and Russian archive sources to combine into this book to examine the battle from both sides. And it gives quotes from the diaries of the German pilots in the Luftwaffe, and what their thoughts were as they were climbing into their aircraft going to attack Russia. It's a really interesting book, and it got taken and accepted into the National Aerospace Library, Farnborough, which is run by the Royal Aeronautics Society. So that was nice because it sort of brought me back to Farnborough, which is where it all started. So that was kind of a rewarding project to be involved in. But I've done other things as well, like technical stuff. I've done work for business around aviation. Um, and I worked on a book for an organisation called, might actually be a good organisation to contact, the AIRC, the Aviation International Research Centre, I believe, in Vienna. They had a book on the history of the 20th century development in aviation, which I was a linguistic editor of. So that was written by their head, Nicola Sciorbielli. So that was a good project to be involved in. And fascinating as well. Probably my favourites, but yeah.
We would have to add so many links to the books you're mentioning, the societies you're mentioning to your podcast. It's going to be quite exciting. And one of my final questions would be, where do you see aviation in the next 10 years? And wherever you see it, what excites you most to be a part of this industry?
Well, if we sort of try and see beyond the situation now, commercial aviation is affected very badly, but I think it's a developmental stage, and a lot of things are changing. If you look, like 4-engine aircraft, and now giving way to 2-engine aircraft and very long-haul flights. That's a massive change, and I think it's becoming much more environmentally aware as well. It wants to promote itself as an environmental means of transport. By looking into words, by looking into things like hydrogen-powered aircraft, and that's going to be fascinating. And electric aircraft as well. That's sort of coming on. That's been talked about now. I noticed there was a flight by quite a small aircraft, I believe, recently that was powered by electric propulsion, if I'm not mistaken. And I know there's some research gone into that. I know the hybrid project, the AX project, was sort of shelved because of the situation right now. But I think there's still a lot of optimism in terms of what the future's going to look like, beyond where we are now, and ways to try and get around things like safety on aircraft in terms of the pandemic. And I think that's going to be interesting. But I think, urban air mobility, I think is going to be interesting as well. A good chance to sort of fly around the city rather than get the tube or whatever. That's going to be fascinating, I think, as well. It's interesting development, and that's coming up fairly shortly. It's sort of gathering pace. And I think those are going to be interesting things as well. The future of airliners, the future of urban air mobility, and how aviation is going to change in terms of our interaction with airports, and when we go through airports, what checks we're going to have to go through, because that's going to all change again as well. Like it did after 20 years ago, after 9/11, it sort of changed then. So all that's going to change as well. The way we travel, the seating arrangements on aircraft, and the capacity of aircraft is going to change as well. And I think the Aerospace Society, and I think one of the biggest areas of development is going to be space, actually. We seem to be, with the development of SpaceX and other organisations looking to go into space and leisure space flights. I think that's going to be a big area of development as well. I'd like it to be, because I think we should go out and develop into space and look at what we can find out there. Right? We have so much to learn, but we know so little really. But I think we're sending rovers to Mars and looking at Mars and going back to the moon. Yeah, interesting. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it goes. I think so.
So That was very interesting, and this is the end of the questions that's set. If
Okay.
anyone here has any questions, I would like them to ask
Yeah,
you.
of course.
Yeah, so hi. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just have a question. It's more of a technical question.
Okay.
So it's when you're translating from
Yeah.
Russian to English.
Yeah.
So you said that you translate the component names from Russian to English.
Yeah.
But when, for example, you have a phrase or a sentence or say a paragraph that you're translating, do you translate every single word or idea verbatim, or do you summarize what's written in Russian and then translate that into English as a group?
Um, no, it's a very good question. I try not just to translate verbatim in a way. Um, I try to translate something um, within the context of the actual the industry that I'm working in. So if it's aviation, I try and I have this. What I'm trying to say, I suppose, is I had this feedback from my client who said, who'd known me for a long time, and she said her clients had told her that I never translate literally. So I actually delve very deep
Right.
um, into the subject matter itself, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, to actually translate what that's going to be in the context of the industry. But translation is a difficult thing to describe really because it's you're not always looking at something doing something literally, but you want to convey the sense and the meaning and everything else. So it's a difficult balance to get right sometimes. But it takes some time. Sometimes you finish a day and you think, sorry, now because I've had to go into delve into things so deeply. But I guess any work like that, like with technical work, work on physics, work on things like that, student work as well, it's going to be that level of detail, that level of effort, and maybe it should be.
Of course. It's getting the semantics correct, effectively.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's have to take everything into consideration, I suppose.
Of course.
Um, does anyone
Hi,
else?
Hi.
for you. Hi, very nice to meet you. I want to ask you, what is your opinion about humans' future space life, and what do you think how the space industry will be in 10 years?
I think, yeah, it's an interesting time, isn't it? Really, we're looking for exoplanets. We're looking for looking to go to Mars. And I think it's a great opportunity to explore and we seem never to have really had the technology and ability we have now to explore that. People like SpaceX coming online, other sort of organizations. It's always just been NASA or ESA or the Russians or all been kind of no, national space programs. Um, but now we've got that flexibility. I mean, if you compare the photos of the footage of Neil Armstrong taking his famous one small step for man, and the footage of the Space Dragon docking with the International Space Station, see how far we've come in space in that time. I think human space, human involvement in space and the exploration of space, I think will still have a big future. I hope it still does because there's so much out there for us to learn and discover more about our context as well, our human context here on Earth, about where we are in the cosmos and our place in the great scheme of things. I think. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up, slightly like a follow-up question to what was asked before, which
Okay.
is I remember when we talked earlier, you mentioned your work on satellite translations and work with space
Oh, yeah.
tech in general. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I did some work on the media on Russian satellites. It was published in the media. And I think I've done some other stuff that is space related at least. It'd be interesting to do some more. And I think Russia is one country that's had so much involvement with the space race, and there's so much material out there that's interesting. I'd like to do some more, and I did definitely do some writing to correct for the media on space related developments as well. So as a translator, it's a little difficult to predict what is going to come through. You might get more material on space, more material on satellites, or something like that. So that's always going to be there. It's quite a broad thing to do with aviation and aeronautics in space. It's quite broad, so you could be finding yourself working on something like that in the future as well. Yeah. I think actually we happen to be recording this on the 11th of October this year, and 11th of October 2019, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov passed away. He was the first person to do a human spacewalk in space. And one of his quotes, if I quote it in Russian and then translate it, «Надеяться всегда нужно на лучшее. Нет веры, придумайте. Нет героев, создайте». He means is, you always have to believe in better. If you have no faith, then conjure it up for yourself. If you have no heroes, then create them. And it's just a wonderful quote to, space exploration is up to us and what we put into it, and a lot of other things. And, very learned man, I think, let's say just a nice quote that happens to be today. But, that's what happened.
This has been a very exciting session, and I'm going to have so much fun adding all the links and re-hearing the whole podcast and actually making a list of everything you've mentioned. But thank you so much for joining us today and part of this podcast.
Thank you so much as well. Very best wishes to you all. Good luck to you, and keep in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.